Hello there, so ranked maps are too generic. That's one of the most common complaints I hear from both players and mappers alike. Nearly every ranked map uses the same basic ideas for how to express music without any attempt to be engaging in a new or interesting way. Frankly speaking, the ranked section lacks creativity. The big question then, why? Why right now are there not many inventive ranked maps? Is being creative with just circles and sliders no longer possible after all these years? I hear a lot of people say creative mapping is dead nowadays, but I really couldn't disagree more. Some old maps from 2013 and earlier are often put on a pedestal compared to modern mapping, but I personally can't find as much appealing about even the best of that period compared to some of the truly innovative maps in the last few years. Before getting too ahead of myself though, what do I mean by generic and creative anyway? Look at 100 recently ranked maps and you'll see some clear patterns in design. I shouldn't need to explicitly describe these. Mappers prefer to use the same type of rhythm construction, the same general spacing idea, the same comfortable smooth movement, the same gameplay components, the same visual choices, etc. There's a few quirks that each individual mapper has, separating them out from the other mappers, however those differences are rarely enough to pop out as creative, especially to a player who doesn't really pay attention to mapping. One argument hauled towards mapping turning generic nowadays is that, unlike in the past, mapping now is regularly treated like a science. Some mappers feel like there's a theoretically best way to organize each element of map design, and those ideals are burnt into the minds of new mappers from the day they start out. That scientific treatment of mapping surely results in generic maps, but it's not as restrictive as I'm making it sound. By the time a mapper fully grasps those ideas, they understand that any type of map design can be acceptable so long as it follows logical design choices. That's why over the last few years, we've seen a huge rise in strict concept-based mapping, which mappers of the past never delved into as much. And the popularization of this general mapping mindset could easily be attributed to the work of Hollow Wings. You know Hollow Wings. He's the guy often viewed as the one truly creative mapper on Osu. Regardless of how invested you are in mapping, you probably have an opinion on his maps starkly leaning towards either end of the love-hate spectrum. Everyone remembers Hollow Wings' maps because they're anything but generic. 2014 was when he really began making an impact on mappers, starting with the ranking of his Sentimental Skyscraper map. As you might be able to see, it was miles beyond the intensity of other ranked maps, plus its aesthetic choices deviated from everything considered good looking, and adding on to that, rhythm choice was often the inverse of what people consider correct. This was a big compilation of weird stuff compared to most maps. If all his maps were like this, I'd think of Hollow Wings as just some amateur mapper who got lucky in the ranking process, but his later maps clearly showed that his way of mapping was more sophisticated than that. Later that year, he ranked The Grimoire of Alice, a map set focused on utilizing the effects of big circle sizes. While the most standout feature of its top difficulty is a cool style of gameplay with highly spaced 4th beat circles, it also showed clear attention to musical representation through a gimmick where the same repeated sound was marked by a circle placed in the center of the playfield. Pulling this off without ruining the map in one way or another is something a lucky amateur mapper wouldn't be capable of doing. While both of those maps were controversial in their own ways, they didn't even compare to the outcry that spawned from his map initially ranked at the end of 2014, Gangu Kaiko. Again, this was a map with a completely different design from the last. It was focused on huge streams, like ones longer than any other maps, separated by sections of vertical sliders organized in the same vein as the Grimoire of Alice's centered objects. Despite how many people said this map's rhythm blatantly ignored the song's rhythm, Hollow Wings argued that it just follows the song differently from what people are used to. There are 4th beat rhythms in the song to back these streams, albeit faint, and there's a clear distinction between major parts of the music. Because the map followed objective reason despite breaking conventions, it was eventually ranked. Throughout 2015, he continued the same philosophy of making maps by giving each of them their own intriguing concepts. In Nanatsu Senzakura, he showcased a form of sharp 4th beat gameplay far different from the Grimoire of Alice. In Helix, he focused on extremely low slider velocity. The Construction Star was designed around only vertical sliders. Tsubaki, ranked the following year, followed Deconstruction Star's model. It had only horizontal sliders this time, plus the extra restriction of sticking only to a large grid. One of his most infamous maps to this day, Notch Hell, or these words, prioritized huge sliders. Because its gameplay is so unusual compared to every map in existence, it led players to learn more about slider mechanics, and that knowledge has made its way to more standard maps today as well. Through this map, Hollow Wings also explained how his mapping process may differ from the majority of mappers. While people like me usually choose a song, then find whatever mapping techniques most appropriately fit the song, Hollow Wings thinks about his mapping ideas first, then finds music that can effectively support it. In Notch Hell's case, that would be the repeated long held vocals in each chorus that fit well with the extremely long sliders that were designed years before he made the map. His most recently ranked or most recently disqualified map, Kaide, should make this process even clearer. Hollow Wings probably had the idea to make a map focused around gameplay with reversing sliders that no other maps had done, and this song was perfect to support it. After learning about this, I decided I want to try it out too, just not very creatively. I took one of Hollow Wings' mapping concepts and searched for a song that would perfectly suit it. In this song, each major downbeat repeats the same sound and separates short phrases of the main instrument. That allowed for something really similar to Grimoire or Valis. I placed a circle in the same position for each downbeat and mapped the melody away from it. Due to the song's composition, I was able to do this in nearly every section too, which, while not being creative, turned out pretty cool, I think. So anyway, concept-based maps are truly creative maps from my point of view. They go against generic mapping by emphasizing a discrete set of rules that, in most cases, no other maps have handled in the same way. Concept-based maps stand out as creative because they're designed around ideas that are recognizably different from those used in generic maps. Thanks to Hollow Wings popularizing concept-based mapping, tons of other mappers have been creating maps in the same mindset for the last few years. They're all more conventional than Hollow Wings, no doubt, but they still have the same goal: to be noticeably different from normal maps, to be in some way creative. Compared to 2013 and earlier, I'd argue that creative mapping is thriving, despite the generic way of mapping becoming more and more uniform at the same time. Creative maps are growing more common as mappers adopt this way of mapping, which means we may have to reword that initially posed question. If creative maps are being made, why doesn't it feel like any are getting ranked? There is no single answer. People have debated about the lack of creativity and the overabundance of generic content in the ranked section endlessly, bringing up lots of legitimate reasons, though none alone is correct. Rather, a combination of reasons is the culprit, and what I consider the most important of those reasons is, unfortunately, not addressed most of the time. Reason 1. The ranking criteria is too restrictive. Being the rules for rankable mapping, the ranking criteria comes to mind as the first limit on creativity, but going through Hollow Wings' mapography has pretty much proven that not to be 100% true. There are a lot of mapping techniques prevented by the ranking criteria, like what we see in Aspire contests. However, creativity can still be achieved within the ranking criteria's limitations. So this reason is valid, but it's not the sole explanation for why creative maps are rare. Reason 2. The nomination system discourages creativity. The ranking process in general is a challenge when you've got a map with anything out of the ordinary. People aren't always sure how to react, and in a system where you need to convince nominators that your map is worthy of rank, anything weird will end up turning some people away. Of course, this doesn't apply to every nominator. Some are more than willing to promote out of the ordinary maps, so again, this can't be the sole reason why either. Reason 3. The community discourages creativity. Mappers and players want creative maps, but not ones like that, you know. Or that, no, get that in the face. You call that a creative map? That's barely even a map. Unless it's the right kind of creativity, a lot of people will end up thinking it's garbage. Ranking a map is a stressful process, and making creative maps adds to that stress due to the average player's aversion to creativity. Hollow Wings' maps, again, are the perfect example here. When on the verge of rank, Gangu Kaiko received pages of mods from angry community members, and after being disqualified, it even got locked off from ranking for a few months. As we all know, the map did eventually get ranked, but my point here is that not everyone is as willing to sit through constant torment about mapping ideals as Hollow Wings. The masses telling you that you're doing something wrong is discouraging, and if you're not extremely stubborn, you'll feel more inclined to rank simple, generic maps instead. Then again, not every creative map is going to cause controversy. It's usually just the most difficult maps that get hate, whereas easier creative maps aren't complained about and are therefore not discouraged. That said, this concern is valid, just not in every case. So those 3 reasons are the most common ones I hear about this topic. If you're a mapper, you've definitely heard them before. There's one more reason I find important though that's rarely brought up. Creative mappers don't care about ranking their maps. Creative mappers are some of the most experienced. Reasonable assumption, right? They know how to vary from generic mapping because they've been mapping for so long. With that experience comes a loss of motivation though, not necessarily for mapping, but for ranking. The main benefit of the ranked section is exposure, and experienced mappers creating the coolest maps don't really need it. Like, Raruchi's maps are getting enough exposure as is, so the appeal of rank disappears for him, and along with it, creative maps from the listing. Loved, being a passive process, is a perfect place for mappers like this. They can just upload their maps, and if people like them, they'll get promoted automatically. Conversely, this also supports why generic maps are so prevalent in the rank section. New and less experienced mappers who naturally make less creative maps have more incentive to aim for rank. People will actually play their maps that would otherwise go unnoticed. This leads to a perceived overabundance of generic maps, and as already stated, a severe lack of creative ones. How can we fix this and get more creative maps ranked? You can't really. Unless the requirements for rank no longer enforce full spreads and the ranking process becomes passive like loved, neither of which I expect to happen in the near future, we'll continue living in the same climate of map diversity. Probably. New incentives for creative mappers are an option too, a current one being a feature in the monthly spotlights, but I'm not sure how many mappers consider that enough, and alternatives are hard to think of. So yeah, creative mapping may not be dead, but it might always feel like that in the ranked section. If you're someone who wants to change that perception though, your best bet wouldn't be worrying about the limitations of the ranking process in the community, but rather just making creative content on your own. And I don't mean like my mapping style is so innovative kind of creativity. I mean like Hollowing style creativity, where mapping style doesn't exist and each map is creative for its own reason. If it wasn't clear yet, Hollowings is an important mapper. Anyway, that's about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Just a warning, next week's video is going to be like an hour long. Also, you don't need to comment about gender, I'm aware.